All right. Well, today I would like to, if we can, just continue doing our class exercise together on Genesis 22. We started last week doing the scene analysis for that chapter. And so what I'd like to do is continue that today, go through the rest of the story with that as part of the narrative analysis. If you'll remember, right, that we look at the setting of the story first, look at the background, the when, the where, even the who, the culture. And then after that, look at the scenes, compare go through each scene. Remember, a scene is kind of like a paragraph in an epistle where each scene presents a particular series of events that are part of the story, and the author presents that scene because he wants to, there's something in that scene or a few things in that scene that he wants us to see that's building the plot of the story. And so scene analysis focuses on breaking down the story into its smaller pieces, its scenes, and then understanding, looking for a few key elements in each of those scenes. And procedure for scene analysis was to first identify each scene in the story, looking for those changes in time or place, sometimes the characters. And then the next step is, after you identify each scene, is to look for these key elements within each scene. So we have the setting, we have who are the key characters in the scene. What are some important comments from the narrator in each scene? And then what are some important statements from the characters in each scene? And by important, I just mean what does it look, what looks to be important based on what you understand of the story at that point, okay? And then composing, putting together a one-sentence summary of the scene, just describe in your own words the focus of that scene. And then finally adding any further observations or comments as you've gone through the scene, maybe some insight or something you hadn't noticed before, or something that you realize may be important to the story, just any general comments that you have. You don't have to have any, but oftentimes I have found that when I study the scene in detail, other things come to my mind that I hadn't noticed or considered before. So I just indicate to do that. Now, we have already done the first scene, but what I'd like to do is just have us read through the story once again together. I'll start with Zali, if you could read verses 1 through 5, and then Shulong, if you could read verses 6 to 10, and then Dwayne, I'll ask you to read 11 to 15. And then Pastor Philip, if you could read 16 to 19, okay? And we'll just, again, read through this account together and then break down the scene. So, Zali, could you start us, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 5. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young man, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you."
Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb from the burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son.
But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said today, "In the mount of the Lord it will be provided." Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven.
And said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will gladly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, so again, after reading the story, then the first thing we want to do for scene analysis is to identify each scene. And we did that last time. We noticed scene 1 took place in the land of the Philistines, and then in Beersheba. And time was, let's see, I'll just do this. Put this next to it here. Okay. Hopefully you can see this on your screen. So scene 1, right, was in Beersheba, and this is where it just says after these things, right? So it's sometime after the events of chapter 21, which is when Isaac was born, and some years have passed because now he can speak. So he's either a boy or perhaps a teenager, young man, and Isaac is. And so after these things, again, sometime after that, then we noticed in verse 3 is the next scene when Abraham rose early in the morning, gathered supplies, and Isaac and left. And then the next scene begins in verse 4. Notice where it says on the third day. So now Abraham has left Beersheba. He's on the third day of his journey to Mount Moriah. And we notice that he's coming towards the place, coming towards Mount Moriah. So that's scene 3. And then scene 4 begins in verse 9, where they're actually now at the place God had identified for Abraham to build the altar. By the way, this is a great example, guys, of notice here, they came to the place which God had told him. And Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. But notice in the story, as you go there, right, look at verse 2. God tells him, right, take your son, go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Well, in the story, the author doesn't tell us that part of the story, right? There's nowhere in the story where we see where God told Abraham to go specifically, right? So God had it talk to him and told him specifically where to go, probably when they arrived near the mountains there. But again, the author did not consider that an important detail to add into the story. That particular statement by God saying, okay, go to that mountain right there at that place. Okay, so this is just, again, another example of how the author controls what information is given in the story, how the author identifies what dialogue, what events to include in the story, because those are what he feels are important for us, the reader, to see. So sometimes there are details in the story or detailed things that happen that aren't put into the story. For example, again here, God actually does tell Abraham the specific location where he wants Abraham to build the altar, but we aren't given that detail in the story. We're simply just told he went to the area and then he went to the place God told him. Well, what place was that? Well, we weren't told the specific place. Abraham knew because God told him, but the author didn't include that particular detail in the story. So this is just, again, another example of the author doesn't just put all the information and everything that happened in the story. He only selects those events or those statements that he feels are important for us to know to follow the plot of the story, the main idea of the story. So I just wanted to point that out. Any questions on that? Did that make sense? This is, again, very common, right? And even John pointed out this fact that, he said, right, the Gospel of John, that if all the stories about, everything that Christ had said and done were written, right, the world cannot contain all the books. He's, of course, using hyperbole, but his point is that, so many things Jesus said and did, and they're not recorded, right? Only those things which the Spirit, the human author, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, as they were writing their Gospels, they only included what Jesus said and did that would contribute to the theological focus of those particular stories. And so this is just a little minor example here in Genesis of this action taking place, okay? All right. So let's get back to the scenes. Welcome, Fue. Good evening. Good to see you.
Yeah, good evening.
So back here again, then, Abraham goes to the specific location that God had indicated to him, and they're at that location at the last scene in verse 9. All right. They came to the place. So this is on the third day from when they left Beersheba. They've come, the location is the specific place where God had told Abraham to sacrifice his son. And then this scene goes up until verse 19, which is the sort of the conclusion of the story, where they return to Beersheba. And then we're given sort of some, the narrator gives us some background information that to continue sort of in the larger narrative in Genesis of what's going on. But this account in Genesis 22 with Abraham and Isaac sort of concludes at verse 19. Okay, so those are the particular scenes that are that we can identify in the story. And then after that, after we identify those scenes, then we want to go through each scene and determine, look for those 6 particular details that I mentioned. Now here what I've done is for each scene that we identified, I sort of, sometimes what I like to do that helps me anyway visually is to identify the different characters in the story. That is, I identify what the narrator says, and I put that in this light blue color. And then I identify what the characters say. And notice I put Abraham, whoops, in yellow, and I should have put God in, or sorry, I put Abraham, put what God said in yellow here, and then what Abraham said in green. And this is just a way to help me visually picture or identify more easily each character in the story, what they say. All right. So, you know, that might be something you want to consider is, you know, circle or underline or highlight each of the characters, you know, when you go through a particular story, if you want. So with that scene, this is what we determined last time we met, that the setting was in the land of the Philistines. After these things, the key characters, just God and Abraham. The important narrator comments, we had determined, you know, the narrator of what the narrator said when he said God tested Abraham. That was a key part we felt, because that gave us an idea of what's going on here in the story. Right from the very beginning, we know really the point of this was God was testing Abraham. The key dialogue. So in looking at what each character said, now here I'm just looking at what God said and what Abraham said. We identified a couple of statements: go to the land of Moriah, that's the main command, and then offer Isaac. Presents a problem here in the story, of course. We had made a couple observations. I think you, Chai, had noted this before, the repetition, the emphasis on Isaac as his son, his only son we loved, and we see that later in the story. And then finally, we put together the summary, which is God tests Abraham, telling him to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac. Okay, so again, notice we're not interpreting like the theological meaning at this point. All we're doing is going through the scene and then identify what seems to be the focus, the key event or key statement within this scene that would summarize sort of the idea, what's happening here in this scene. And in this case, it is God tested Abraham by telling him to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac. Okay. Okay, so hopefully that gets us current, up to speed. Are there any comments or questions before we look to the next scene together? Anybody have anything? Everything's perfectly clear then. Well, that's good. All right. Well, if that is the case, then let's go to the next scene. And again, here I just highlight, I'm using the same convention, the same approach, where I highlight the narrator comments in blue and then any character comments in green or yellow. And what's one thing that we should notice right away here from this particular scene?
There is no dialogue.
There's no dialogue. Exactly. This is just a statement by the narrator who's carrying along the events of the story. And again, notice there's no, when we go from scene 2 to scene 3, right? Scene 3 is on the 3rd day. So notice here, the narrator chooses not to discuss or describe anything that happened except Isaac got up, got his supplies, and went to the place where God had told him. And that's it. Okay, so really this particular scene we can do pretty quickly, honestly, right? It's the journey. Where is the journey to Moriah, and when is early morning the next day after he received the instruction? The key characters, well, really it's the characters mentioned are Abraham, Isaac, and the 2 young men, but they don't have any dialogue, and not much takes place. So the narrator comments really is what drives this whole part, you know, maybe identifying Abraham rose early in the morning. And again, we aren't given the reason he rose early. Could have been, and most people interpret this as his, he obeys quickly and responds quickly, and clearly he does that. Some people have theorized or maybe guessed that perhaps he left early in the morning so that Sarah would not find out. We don't know. So we have to be careful we don't add in details that the author doesn't include. All right. And that's very, very tempting. And it's hard to avoid, is we can put in thoughts and feelings and motives that may or may not be there. You know, a lot of people talk about how Abraham would have felt as a father, and you know, that he got up early because he wanted to obey quickly, and you know, and certainly this could be the case. My tendency is to think it is, based on later what God says. You know, God commends Abraham for his obedience, but you know, we have to just be careful we don't add in thoughts and motives that aren't clear in the story by the author. So I think it's perfectly fine to, you know, put in our own thoughts at times, you know, and say, perhaps, you know, if I were in Abraham's position as a father, you know, this would be obviously very hard. So certainly we would think Abraham would have a challenge and struggle with this a little bit, but we have to be careful we don't go into this whole description of Abraham's feelings as a father, and because we don't know what they were. We can guess, but we don't know for sure. Later in Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, identified one thought that Abraham had as he was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. Later, the author of Hebrews tells us that Abraham knew God could raise the dead. So we learn there that Abraham assumed that God would raise up Isaac after he sacrificed him. And so we don't see that explicitly in the story. We do have a few hints of it, but that was something I think the Spirit later made perfectly clear to the author of Hebrews. But we are not writing scripture, and so we may not be given the those specific details or insights, only what is in the story. So I just want to caution us. This is easy to do with narratives, as we're trying to preach the story and grab people's interest and tell the story in a way that's what's the word I'm looking for? In a way that will draw people in a way that will interest people, in a way that will get people to follow you and what's going on in the story. And that's good. We want to do that, but we have to be careful we don't add too much into the story that's not there explicitly. Okay. And we need to be careful when we are adding our theories or our own insights. That's okay to do. Just make sure you're clear, that, for example, you might say something like, we aren't told Abraham's feelings exactly here, but as a father, I certainly would be very nervous and emotionally, this would be very hard. So certainly you can bring that point up. Just be careful you don't give Abraham thoughts and feelings that the author doesn't tell us. Okay, does that make sense? And this is a real skill to do this. To tell a story well, you add some details, but you can't put things in the text that the Spirit didn't want there or didn't choose to include. Now, a lot of times as you go through a story, there are certain things that, based upon your understanding of the story, that you might, like I said, for example, later, God commends Abraham's obedience. So you might say, Abraham rose early in the morning, showing his willingness to obey even something hard. And I think that's perfectly acceptable based on what we learn later in the story. But again, just a caution to us to be careful that we focus mainly on what the author focuses on. All right. Thoughts about that? Anyone have a comment or?
I find it quite normal that he didn't sleep very well the night before.
Yeah, that could be another reason he got up early. I mean, that's a good point. It'd be hard to sleep.
And then for 3 days, I don't think he slept very well. And why did he carry wood? I wondered about that. Unless it was special wood, there was plenty of wood around. Obviously, it was a ram caught in the thicket, so there's plenty of stuff around, but he carried the wood. And it's interesting, he carried fire. They didn't have matches or a lighter, or I don't know if you can get a fire going by rubbing two sticks together. I've often wondered about that. That sounds a little bit far-fetched, but he carried fire, and so that would have been interesting exactly how they did that. But there's little things. Of course, there's the main things. This is little things. But yeah,
that's a really good observation. Really good question. Yeah. What you would assume there'd be wood there. Why does he bring it with him from the beginning? Yeah, and it may be a small detail that really isn't important to the story, but sometimes you might have these questions that actually are important to the story, like to the main idea of the story. But yeah, that's something I hadn't thought about before. Why did he load up the wood then from his home instead of just waiting until he got there? Maybe he didn't know what the land was like, and there may not be wood there. We don't know for sure, but so this would be a good example of an observation you would put in as you're going through the story. So I put it in here. Just an observation that you might make. That's something that maybe you didn't catch before. All right, so back to our 6 elements here. Are there any other thoughts or comments about what what I was just saying about the not adding things into the story, or just being careful how we tell it?
I'm just thinking that it is a very good caution not to inject into the narratives sometimes our own thought or our own, sometimes even imaginations, especially when it comes to the emotional part of, or trying to, I'm not sure it's such a word, emotionalized the whole story. You know, how it must be so difficult for Abraham, this is his only son. Yeah, it is, but the narratives didn't quite use any emotional words in Genesis 22, because when we invoke the emotions of the congregations, and the emotions is a very strong and powerful thing, and it's a whole, you know, I mean, a lot of the Pentecostal preacher does that. They invoke a lot of emotions and say, do you love God more than this? You know, things like that. So I think we have to be, it's a very good caution to have.
Yeah, and there's, you know, I think like the point Dwayne just brought up about Abraham not sleeping much, you know, again, we're not told how many hours he slept, but I think that's certainly a reasonable statement. You know, as you're telling the story, you could say, you know, probably Abraham didn't sleep well the night before. Now, we can't say with certainty, but if we're just careful in how we describe things that aren't given explicitly in the story, then it's okay. If you're saying, you know, using words like, you know, if it were me, I'd have trouble sleeping that night. But you know, we aren't told exactly, but this, you know, but you can still add in your opinions as long as you're clear that it's your opinion. Or if you have some justification or reason from the story that gives you that opinion as well, you can mention that. I'm just saying, because, you know, again, we want to tell the story in a vivid and engaging way, and to do that, sometimes we add some details that may not be specifically in the story, but it's likely part of what happened. But we just want to make sure as we're telling it that we indicate those places that we're just making an assumption versus those places that clearly that's part of the story that the narrator included. So I'm just trying to make that distinction of being a good storyteller, but also being an accurate one, I guess would be the balance here that I want us to at least think about. Because I hear guys quite often, I think you were alluding to this, that sort of run with something in the story and they make a whole, you know, elaborate or big point about it, and it may not even be something we know for sure from the story, you know, but they make this point and make application. So if you're not sleeping well at night, you know, you need to do this and this and this, you know, and it's like, well, okay, but is that what the author's wanting to draw our attention to in the story? Again, I think it's perfectly acceptable to point out, you know, that, you know, what was Abraham thinking that night? And certainly, you know, I wouldn't have slept very well, so he may not have either. That's certainly acceptable, but then don't run off into this whole, you know, discussion about, you know, insomnia or what to do when you can't sleep well, or this kind of thing.
Then it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to children, now that's a whole different thing. And if you're talking to teenagers, well, that's another thing. Now you got to talk about the two young men. You know, you can work them in. You get to draw the teenagers in. Of course, you got all the grandpas, then you can make it pretty dry and pretty straightforward and theological. And it depends. And then if they're going to sleep, I tell you, if your people are going to sleep, now you got to come up with a story real fast and you grab their minds. You know, you keep your eyes on the people you're talking to, and you do what you have to keep them engaged. The little children, now you got to do some theatrics. You got to do some jumping around, you know. anyway, it's fun, you know, and it's really, you've got to stay awake and you've got to be excited about this. I mean, whether it's grandpas or children. Of course, children take a huge amount of energy. You really got to have energy, but and teenagers, of course, that too. I mean, you have to make adjustments. But oh boy, yeah. But the stories like this really lend themselves to. You got to be creative, but stick with what you know is true, and then of course you're safe. The rest of it is just, I guess, to keep them engaged.
Yeah, that's a good point. You don't want anyone falling out the window, sleep.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yes, obviously the age is going to matter. So a little bit later on, and when we get to the preaching narratives, we're going to talk about some of these things and sort of how you engage. You can't tell the story like you would preach an epistle, you know. There's got to be, it's a story. So certainly we have to tell the story in such a way that's engaging, that helps people to follow, that you highlight key elements in the story, but do it in a way that keeps people focused. And yeah, if you can tell a story accurately to children, that's really I tell guys, you know, if you want to be good storytellers, then you need to teach children. That's going to help you get better at it, because if you're not engaging with the kids, like Dwayne's pointing out, I mean, they're easily distracted. You'll lose them. But so you have to really work at telling a story well to children. And if you can do that, I think you'll be very effective with adults. So good point. So now just kind of closing up this scene, and then I'm going to have you guys work on scene 3. But we look at important narrator comments. Really, maybe Abraham rose early in the morning. Again, we're just looking at what we think might be key comments in light of the story. Key dialogue, well, this one's easy because there's none. There's no speaking here, which again, I think is interesting, that 3 days, right, go by between scene 1 and scene 3, between verse 2 and verse 4, and the author doesn't include anything of what took place there. What was anything said? We don't know. I mean, did they not talk to each other for those few days? We don't know. Did they encounter some robber or some animals, or did they have any problems or any? We don't know. Did they, you know, look for food? Did they go hunting? Did they have enough food that they brought with them? We don't know. Again, there's details here that just the author said it's not important for the point of the story. What is important is the things that I mentioned, the author says, right? So he only tells us about enough details to help us see the story, right? So we have enough details in this scene that we can picture the donkey being loaded up. We can picture the wood that's on the donkey. We can picture the Abraham and Isaac, and then these 2 young men that come with him. We can picture them starting to walk away towards the place God told them. So the narrator gives us enough information so that we can, you know, picture the story. He doesn't just go from verse 2, right, which was verse 2 was the God telling Abraham to go to the place that I'll tell you. He could have jumped right to scene 3. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes, saw the place. But he chose to include scene 2. So obviously there's some details here that he felt were important, either to carry the story along, or maybe there's a detail here, like Abraham getting up early, that the author wants to make sure that we understand. And so he adds this verse 3, this second scene, to give us a few details, but there's no dialogue. The author didn't choose to include any of that. So then as we get to, a summary of the scene, I would put something like Abraham obeyed and journeys to Moriah with Isaac. Okay, just simple statement like something like that. Okay. So this scene's relatively easy. We don't have any dialogue, so it's just a short statement by the narrator. Now, what I'd like you to do is for the third scene here, I'd like you to take a few minutes on your own and just go through the scene and identify the details I mentioned here. So identify the setting, the key characters, the important narrator comments, any other additional observations, and then the summary. Okay. So go ahead and I'll give you guys a few minutes to do this on your own, and then we'll come back together and discuss it. Are there any questions before we do that? All right, so I'll give you some time. I'll be here. If you do have any questions that come to your mind, you can ask, okay? But with that, let me start the recording again. Okay, there we go. All right. So Tongan, yeah. What is the setting here? Again, the where and the when.
The when is after he was leaving from his home. So on the third day.
Okay, I'll put on the third day of his journey.
And then the place on the word is in Palestine, specifically near Moriah. Yeah, Moriah, where
Yep.
he was heading.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So near, or we could say approaching.
Yeah.
Approaching. Okay, good. All right. Fue, how about the key characters? Who are the key characters in this scene?
Okay. The first one be Abraham. The second
Yes.
one is Isaac. The third one is the young man.
Yeah, the two young men are in the story, and then they are left. So you could note those if you want. They're not key characters, but they are in the story, so we could identify them. But Abraham and Isaac certainly are the main characters. All right, good. Okay, how about important narrator comments? Maybe Pastor Philip, what did you put for that?
I put verse 6. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hands the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together.
Okay, so
I thought that it is the comment of the narrator.
yes, okay. So Abraham put the wood on Isaac and brought as Dwayne mentioned earlier, that they had the torch or flame with them. Okay. Anything else that seems important? Again, we're just looking for what seems to be important in that the narrator mentions that carries the story. Anything else you think?
I have noted, in addition to verse 6, also the last part of verse 8, where this phrase is repeated in the end of verse 6 and end of verse 8,
Yes.
which is the two of them walk on together.
Yes. Very good
Yes,
observation.
yes.
He repeats it.
Yeah.
This. So there seems to be something that he wants to emphasize to us. This is kind of, I mean, what does that communicate to you, Chai? That repetition. What might the narrator be trying to do here?
Well, I was just thinking of a question, but I'll come back to the question shortly. The fact that the narrator, in this case Moses, repeated this phrase, he obviously wanted his audience to take note of this phrase, so the two of them walk on together. It's a bit like if any one of us is to write our narratives, and then we repeated saying that strawberry ice cream is really nice, and the fact that I repeated twice, I want the audience to know that strawberry ice cream was really nice. So that's quite straightforward. But that it brings up a question in my mind: why the emphasis of the two of them? And in fact, then I have a related question: why were the two young men included as in the narratives, right from scene 2 and scene 3, but they were left behind by Abraham? And these two young men was not narrated or was not recorded that they had said anything or they have done anything in particular. So why would he include these two young men when it appears that they don't have any particular contribution to the story?
Yeah, great question. I put that under the observation here. Perhaps, one, it could be a detail of the story. Sometimes the author includes some details to help us see the story in our mind. Another reason, and one I would lean towards, is probably because of what Abraham said to them in verse 5. That I believe there's something important in Abraham's statement in the story, so the author included these two young men because they were the ones that he made this statement to. And so perhaps what Abraham said here, the author clearly felt what he said here was important to the story because he puts it in. But perhaps that's why the young men are here, because he said it to them. So the author is setting up the fact earlier in the story, he says he brought two young men with him. Perhaps because later on the third day, he's going to say something to them that is important for the reader to see, to read. So maybe we will worship and return to you. Perhaps that's helping us to see another example of Abraham's faith here in this story. Again, and at this point, we're just offering ideas. Okay, we can't be certain this early on in our study, but certainly it's perfectly fine to make have thoughts and ideas about that. That's the whole point of this, really. We're just trying to go through the story to generate in our minds thoughts, questions that we're thinking about each part of this story to help us as we try to understand and interpret it. So yeah, that's a great observation. My question: why are the two young men in the story?
No, I was thinking, I think the 2 lessons ago, Pastor T, when we were using John chapter 4 as the example, and you have helped us to think in a very good way to ask, what if the middle part of John chapter 4, the disciples' conversation with our Lord is asking, have you eaten anything? What if that part wasn't included in John chapter 4? The story of our Lord conversation with the Samaritan woman, and the Samaritan woman went to her village, would still flow on. So we ask, well, why did John? So likewise, if these young men were not included in Genesis 22, the story will still flow on. So there must be a reason, I hope, that Moses included these two young men. And then you come to verse 5, he said, verse 5, is it? Yeah, we will go over, we will worship, and we return to you. And the repeated phrase, so the two of them walk on together. Now, my imagination is this. I don't know whether I'm right or I'm just maybe thinking too much. Is it because this sacrifice of Isaac is the father and son business? or is strictly between the father and the son? I'm just, all these
Yeah.
questions at the back of my mind. Yeah.
No, and that's things you would write down. Again, and observations. Again, as you're looking at this scene, you know, thoughts are coming to your mind, and maybe trying to understand the details here of the scene and why certain things are there. This is exactly why we do the scene analysis, because it helps us to consider these kinds of questions. And then we're looking at the story, trying to answer them, right? So as we go through the rest of the story, and then we come back, we're going to do character analysis, where we're going to focus on statements by the characters and actions. And then we're going to come back and do the plot analysis, where now we're look sort of at, okay, now that we've studied the setting and the scenes and the characters, let's try to understand the arc of the story. That is, what is the main point of it? And so as you do the scene analysis, these questions and thoughts will help you, because later you may see something in the next scene, or as you think about the plot, like, oh, okay, this makes sense. So good. These are great questions. Any other comments about the narrator?
May I? Yeah, I
Yeah,
was also attracted to the repetition at the end of verse 6 and end of verse 8, except that I decided to read also from the NIV. At the end of verse 6, the NIV puts it as the two of them went on together, comma, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, father. So I was taken up by the usage of the word as to its grammatical function here. And it appears that it is put there as to say that something is happening at the same time as something else. I mean, as their thoughts could be on what Abraham was going to do, you know. So while he was walking, the two of them were going on towards the place where God has told him, Abraham could be thinking of something, and then the narrator decided to give us the thought of Isaac, where he asked his father, say, Father, you have the fire and wood here. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering? So obviously along the journey up to the place where, Isaac was to be sacrificed, Isaac himself would have been thinking, now, where is this lamb for the burnt offering? So as they were going up, so this thought was in Isaac's mind. And then when we came to, when we come to the end of verse 8, Abraham provided the answer, which in a sense, I think it reflects Abraham's confidence in God. So God himself provided. And so full stop, and the narrator says, and the two of them went on together. It sounded very conclusive there. And okay, now I've given this answer, and let's move on. Let's go on to this place. You know? So it's just a usage of one of the as as grammatical function and as another grammatical function.
Yeah, sometimes those are features that the translation just adds in to smooth out the story a little bit, help us follow it. But you kind of you have identified a few important statements that we put under the section on dialogue here, key dialogue. Maybe I should highlight these. It's easier to see. So let's just move to that part here. The key dialogue. One thing you mentioned, Abraham's response, God will provide, shows his confidence in God. What was the other? You made another comment, I think, about the dialogue, Daniel.
Yeah, I was saying at the end of verse 6, the word as was used. So while they were walking, Isaac's mind must have been conjuring a lot of thoughts, and one of these would be, of course, asking the father, where's the lamb?
Yeah.
For an offering. And then in verse 8, Abraham was, perhaps reflecting his confidence, says, this is it, God is going to provide, full stop. And the narrator says, and they went together. So no sort of no more issue. Let's go to the place where God has told us.
And it's kind of interesting, you know, Isaac asks, where is the lamb? There's a little bit of irony there, isn't there? Because he is the lamb.
Right.
At
Yeah, but
this point,
at
this
that
point in
of
the
time,
story.
He was wondering, is he saying?
Yeah, where's the sacrifice at? Well, right, it's a sobering irony that actually he, you know, at this moment in the story, right, we don't know what's going to happen. So, you know, the one asking the question actually is the answer to his question, but Abraham doesn't, you know, give him a direct answer, obviously, at that point, but tells him God will provide.
Yeah, and
So,
whereas in your passage there, the Moses used the word I mean the translators use the word soul for both statements. So the two of them walked on together, and so the two of them walked on together. It's the function of soul. You know, it sounds as though that it is, while it joins the two ideas, but there's a full stop after the first soul, as well as the second one. So the two of them walked on together. Whereas the NIV provides a sort of, while they're walking, as they were walking, Isaac's mind must have been working as well while walking, and that is why he raised the question. So I thought that would be quite an interesting situation, you know, because Isaac don't know what's all about, you see. And so he asked during the course of the journey up to the mountain, Isaac asked the question, and then at the end of verse 8, it's like, you know, I suppose that is a very concluding kind of sentence. So the two of them walked on together. I mean, it's, no more discussion, period.
yeah, almost adds to the soberness of the situation, right? That you just get this picture of father and son walking, and then the son asking this very, honest question, and that's a real sobering one, I think. That where's the sacrifice, Dad? It's, well, son, it's you. But obviously Abraham didn't tell him that, and we can't be sure what, when Abraham said God will provide, whether he thought God would provide another thing for sacrifice, or just that, son, God will take care of this. So this is an interesting, very poignant part. And again, this is the only dialogue that between Abraham and his son in the story, right? This is the only, verses 7 and 8 are the only statements or interaction that we are given by Moses, by the author, between Abraham and Isaac. All right, now it's possible that, they went 3 days and didn't say a word to each other. I doubt that. Certainly it's possible, but I think they likely said a number of things on the journey. But this is the only interaction that is given between Abraham and Isaac for their entire trip, right? Even when he offers Isaac on the altar, when they get to the place, we don't know what was said between them, if anything. So, I know they're two guys, so, guys don't talk a lot, but I doubt they were completely silent for 3 days. So, but so it's very interesting, right? These are the comments that the dialogue that the author chooses to reveal, and it's all surrounding, where's the sacrifice? And then Abraham said, God will provide. And keep that in mind, because as we look at the next scene, which we'll have to do next week, because we won't have time today, but as we look at the next scene, we're going to see that word provide repeated a couple of times.
Yep.
And when we're reading something like this, of course, we know the Holy Spirit gives every word, every punctuation, every reflection, every word's important. And it's obviously about Abraham, not about Isaac, not about the two boys, whatever. I get hung up on the wood because I was a little kid. I did a lot of splitting. And it's dawning on me now that it takes quite a bit of equipment to split wood. You got to have wedges, you got to have a heavy maul or a hammer, and they're not going to carry that along. And you've got to have kindling. Now, when I was a kid, of course, it was cold where I come from, and we made a lot of fires. And you don't make fires with big pieces of wood. You got to have kindling, and of course, you get a dry piece, and it talks about in the beginning, before they even started out, they apparently had equipment back in the camp that Abraham split wood. I mean, this is little splinters that you can start a fire with. You can't start a fire with big chunks of wood. They weren't carrying a big pile of wood. They were carrying what we call kindling. And I built enough fires. We camped a lot. And of course, we had cook stoves and we had space heaters, and it was all wood until I was more than a teenager. And so you've got to have kindling. And so they made kindling, and that's what it was. And then they had some kind of device to carry coals to keep them going. Some kind of, I suppose a carrier, because they carried their fire, very obvious. It wasn't a torch. That would have went out. It had to be some coals that they kept going, and they'd have been buried in ashes, and they'd stay going indefinitely. And you have the right wood, it won't burn up real quick. It'll just glow. And then you take the kindling. Well, that's another thing. This is about Abraham and his faith. And notice it says right away he lifted up his eyes. He was looking. Was he familiar? Well, he was looking for a high place, and he knew the area that they were to go to, and he knew some things, and he was looking. And whether they were talking or not, he lifted up his eyes and saw the high place, and then he got rid of the audience. I mean, this was between Abraham and Isaac. And Isaac, of course, saw the knife. There was the wood, there was the fire, but there was the knife. That's important. You don't carry a knife for nothing. And this was one obviously used in sacrifice. And that caught Isaac's eye. He doesn't mention it, but the knife, we know it was mentioned that Abraham carried a knife. And as they walk along, Isaac, they're both submitted. Obviously, Isaac is submitted to his dad. He is going to do what his dad says. He's a good boy. And of course, Abraham is our father in the faith. He's submitted to God. He has faith in God. He knows this is all for good purpose, and this is for all I suppose for something very important. This was a big thing. This was not a small thing. Going to offer your son is not a small thing. This is a big thing. But Abraham was submitted to God. Isaac was submitted to his dad. And they just kept going. And this is amazing. 3 days they kept going until all at once Abraham sees, lifts up, he's looking, and then he gets real private between him and Isaac, and they keep going. They don't quit. Isaac and Abraham do not quit. We don't quit, even if we don't understand it. And they're walking together. I mean, that is so, we would say sweet. That's more than sweet. That is blessed. They walk together. And when Abraham said God will provide a lamb, that was a shot in the dark. That borders on a lie. I mean, he's covering up the fact that he is going, and we know Hebrews said he was going to sacrifice him. But he says God will provide. He didn't know that. But he said that, I think now that was probably under inspiration. He said that. And it was true. God did provide a lamb. But Abraham didn't know that. God is so much better than what Abraham thought, what we think. And he's way ahead of us. But it was okay. But that is kind of an interesting statement. God will provide a lamb. Abraham did not know that. But God did provide a lamb. And so we would say that, understand the Spirit led him to say that. And I don't know what Isaac thought about that. But that is okay. They kept going because Isaac trusted his dad. Abraham trusted God. And what a beautiful lesson and story and conclusion and I guess example of faith. Boy, that made the whole 11th chapter of Abraham. Of Hebrews, 11th chapter of Hebrews. That made the whole chapter. Everything followed right in line with that. Abraham is our father in faith. This is a tremendous, fore prophecy of what God was going to do. And God actually gave his son. He didn't spare him at all. In this case, Abraham was able to spare, and God provided a lamb. So, there's just no end to the good meanings here and to the, pictures of the grace of God, the great grace of God. There's submission. There's all kinds of things here, but it's Abraham's a chief actor, obviously. Everything else is secondary. Good. That tickles me pink, like my mom used to say. It is just glorious. I don't know. That's what I see here in me. I like it. I think it's.
May I add something?
Example.
Yeah, shoot on.
Okay, instead of the first point regarding the faith, and the second is the sonship obedience. I saw it from the Hebrews 10, verse 5. Okay, called what is that? Psalm 40, 6-8, about preparing the body. This is a sonship submission. The basic for the sonship submission. And the third point is about the walk together. What I'm talking about is the walk together. I saw the third point is to indicate, to picturize the oneness of the Son and the Father. From John chapter 10, verse 30. Okay, when this is the context is saying that the Christ bear his life to his to the lamb, the frogs, and said about the giving life matter. So the end conclusion is my Father and I is one. Okay, this is what I see from the walk together matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Shunan. Yeah, and these might be, thoughts you could put down under the observation section as you're writing. Obviously, we want to be careful not to make conclusions right now, but certainly we can see connections or things that come to our mind that, is this part of the story meant to show us this particular truth? And so I think at this point in our study, we want to be careful not to make conclusions, but certainly we can offer insights or our own thoughts as to what might be going on. And that's why I said, that's why I include the observation element here, because these are the thoughts that come to mind, you know, perhaps other passages like Shulong mentioned, that pop into your mind or come to your attention as you're going through the story. And so I would, I'd again put those ideas down in the observation section. So we're just, you know, careful that we don't conclude anything yet at this point. You know, we can offer, we're basically just noting things, and at this point identifying what we think looks important and what we think might be helpful to understand the overall story. So, and there's a big temptation sometimes too because if you're familiar with, you know, other scriptures, sometimes to at this stage draw in those other passages, and we want to be careful with that. Certainly, again, it's fine to, if in your mind, you know, Hebrews 11 pops in your head, like, oh, I remember that this statement was made in that chapter. That's perfectly fine. We just want to be careful that we don't impose a later interpretation onto this story yet at this point. We want to just try to understand the story in its context first, and then we can include some of these other references in other places. But it's certainly fine to note those here, because if that comes into your mind, then you could mention it. For example, you could say, you know, Hebrews 11, I forget the exact verse. Hebrews 11, 19, right, is a reference to, refers to, or actually 17 to 19, right?
But Esau?
Refers to this event.
Since the
Yeah, here, I think I got it on your
Yeah.
screen. I've shown both of them, yeah. So again, if these ideas come to your mind, that's totally fine to include them. Just being careful. We want to be careful not to be definitive in interpreting them at this stage. But yeah, these are all great observations, great questions, great insights, you know. And for me, just focusing attention, verses 7 and 8 seem to be the focal point here. That really brief dialogue between Abraham and Isaac, and again, the only dialogue that they have. I think I mentioned, here, this is the only dialogue between Abraham and Isaac for the whole 3-day journey. So it seems to be a key part of the story, or at least definitely a key part of the scene, in my mind. So how would we summarize this? Zali, how would you summarize this particular scene? In a sentence. What do you think?
I have no idea what to summarize.
That's fine.
But yeah, but my mind is, you know, that so the two of them walk on together is the same sentence, but it's going to two different directions. That's my observation, because the first one is they are going towards to the place. The second one is they are coming back to the place. And my mind is, for the two young men, could be the witness of these things, because they saw them walk on together, maybe peacefully, and come back together peacefully. That's my observation. And I think that is maybe at some point the two men could be give us some idea to the witness, because this offering business is quite private. I think it's because Abraham doesn't want to see to the two men of maybe his slave, but at the same time he doesn't want to let Isaac know on the way until the last minute.
Yeah, in fact, I think, yeah, verse 19, right, it mentions that Abraham returned to the young men. So yeah, they saw them, Abraham and Isaac leave, and then return a little later. But yeah, that's a good point, right? They don't know what happened up there.
No.
Only Isaac and Abraham and the Lord know what took place. All right, good. Anybody have a idea maybe how they would summarize this scene? Or want to offer their suggestion?
My summary is Abraham continued the journey to the mountains with his son by walking together.
Okay. Certainly that's an element, right? They walked by walking together. How might we incorporate sort of what was said? That seems to also be a important piece to that. Is there a way we could add that into this summary here?
I summarized it as Abraham's faith that God will provide.
Okay. Or Abraham's
Faith, yeah.
Abraham's faith that God. All right. Okay. Anyone else want to add, modify, change? And I might, at this point in the story, I might not include this idea of faith yet, because we don't know the whole story yet. I might say something like, if I were to include, I think both of these sentences include, I might say, as they walk together to Mount Moriah, Abraham tells Isaac, God will provide the sacrifice, or you could just say God will provide, something like that. So yeah, the journeying together obviously seems to be important to the author. He repeats that, and then just trying to summarize this dialogue between them. So that's how I put it together as a summary, because I think you need both elements. Obviously, there's continuing the journey together, and then also the interaction, the dialogue they have. Now, again, we're not certain yet when Abraham said God will provide, as Dwayne pointed out, well, that's a little bit, is he lying here, or does he have this faith? We don't know exactly yet what's going on. We have an idea, but this is where, it's a challenge in going through stories that we're familiar with, because we already know it, sort of God's response at the end. So it's hard to not import that back into the earlier scenes in the story. So we just want to, again, we're trying to just follow as if this was the first time we're reading it. and sort of the insights that we would have at this point. But it's not, again, there's not necessarily a, only one way to summarize this, but just some things that we want to keep in mind as we're doing that. So
I think we got to use the word submission, because certainly Abraham was submitted to God.
yeah,
Isaac was submitted to his dad. You can't get around it. And it just hangs out all over. And it keeps the story going, and nobody quits. Abraham is submitted to God. He's the prime mover and the one that's carrying the storyline. And yeah, Lord help us if we're not submitted.
yeah. So we could even include that element in that Abraham continues in his obedience at this point, right? So yeah, good point. Okay, so I guess we'll have to wait till next time we gather to go through the last scene there, but hopefully this helps you to see just kind of how you break down the scene and what to look for. And again, some very, very good observations, guys. Good insights, comments, questions as you're looking at. This is exactly what this step is intended to do, is to promote these things as we're going through the story. Okay, any final comments or questions?
Well, I still like the wood. I like the kindling. I like that smells a mystery. Why in the world are they carrying this wood? Obviously, they're not carrying a torch. Get rid of that idea. It's a little device of some kind with some glowing coals in it, but it's kindling. And if you've ever started a fire, you don't start a fire with big chunks. You got to have little slivers. And so that wouldn't be a big deal. And then, of course, there's plenty of other wood to add. But you notice he's going to slaughter his son before he starts the fire. They don't start the fire first. And then he binds his son and lays his son on the fire. That didn't work. That didn't happen. But anyway, it's just very interesting.
Yeah, obviously he has the fire because he has the expectation, right, that he's going to actually be doing this. So
yeah, and that knife, I'm sure it's mentioned. That it's not mentioned by accident. There's a knife, and Isaac definitely saw that. He doesn't mention it, but he does mention the wood and the fire. And there's only one thing left, a knife. And so that makes Isaac a little bit uncomfortable, but he trusts his dad. Don't we all? We have to. It's what we do. If you want to live long, you have to trust your dad. That was worked into me by my Sunday school teachers. If you want to live long, you got to honor your parents. So I was very careful. And I'm going to have my 83rd birthday. And I'm delighted that I had a chance to obey my parents, and God's faithful.
when is your birthday?
In 25th of October is coming up. They're going to they're going to start paying me to go to the gym. I'm getting so old.
Wow. Happy early birthday. We'll have to remember that when we.
People got me bugged to no end. They keep telling me how old I am and I should be dead already. And God has promised me to give me all the life I need to finish what He's called me to do. And I trust Him. But it's hard because all these people are saying, "Aren't you dead yet? Well, how come you're still around?" My best friend just died. His heart just quit, and they buried him last Friday back home. I got to see him just before, and I looked at him, I said, "Oh boy, this is not good." And sure enough, less than a month later, he was having his funeral. But when you get old, this gets serious.
Yeah.
And so I keep telling people I probably won't see you again when I go back, because I probably won't. And now we're talking about other things, but anyway, God's the one in charge, and Abraham knew that. And Isaac trusts his dad, so we live by faith, don't we?
Mm.
And
And that's
Well,
kind of the way that the writer of Hebrews, right, recognized that.
well,
This
that's
is
what
one
the
of those
Bible is.
key examples.
Anyway, praise the Lord.
That's
It's getting
good.
late. I'm tired. I'm old and getting tired.
All right, well, Dwayne, why don't you close us in prayer then? Before you do that, I just want to mention next week, actually, I'm traveling to the Philippines. Next Tuesday night, I'm scheduled to preach at a church, so I won't be available next Tuesday, but we'll plan to have class on October 4th when I'll still be in the Philippines, but hopefully I can be set up. But September 27th, next Tuesday, I've got another a preaching engagement, so I won't be able to do the class. So we'll pick it up together on October 4th, and hopefully finish the story. But this has been I've really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you guys for your input. It's been great. But that said, so we'll see each other again, Lord willing, in a couple weeks. But